Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy at Catholic Studies Academy. And before we get started, I want to let all of our listeners know that we have several different options at our website for you to attend classes. We have classes that you can buy outright and go at your own pace. We have the subscription model, so you can sign up and you can take a number of different courses in philosophy and theology, and again, take them at your own pace. You have a wide array of different options of classes that you can take. And I also want to invite our listeners, please hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, because that really helps us out and really helps grow our community here on all the different platforms. All right, let's get to it. So today the topic is going to be happiness, right?
Right.
Yeah. So we're going to try to fight all the fluffy junk that's out there, and approach this from a philosophical perspective, as
right.
we like to do here, and as Dr. Smith likes to do. And so what we want to do today is really look at happiness from Aristotle and from the ancients, right? And we want to also try to we'll bring in Christianity at the end, but we really want to try to look at it not necessarily through the lens of Christianity, but kind of natural understanding of happiness. So looking at the ancients will give us a good way, and they'll be our good guides today. Sure. To look at it in this way. So Dr. Smith, let's get us started here. Maybe we can, as we do a lot of times, just define our terms. What do we mean by happiness? What are the other aspects of life, right? Or what are the other aspects of myself that are important? Desires. Sure. What is the good? What are the ends? All of these things. Maybe put it together for us.
Yeah. So Aristotle, one of the, a lot of what I say here is going to be kind of inspired by the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. I'm not going to just restrict myself to that, but a lot of it's inspired by that. The Nicomachean Ethics is a wonderful book in a lot of ways. It was really kind of the book that converted me to Aristotle. I think a lot of people have had that experience. When you read, the first time the Nicomachean Ethics, you're just sort of blown away. One of the things that's really fun and interesting about the Nicomachean Ethics is Aristotle he's very concise and he brings up important insights and questions, but it's almost kind of, he lets the exploration wander a little bit.
Yeah.
Because he'll come back to the same point over and over again and say, it seems we've arrived at where we began. Right. And I think that's because, it's sort of exploratory. There is a systematic aspect to it, but it is a very exploratory work. And that's fitting, I think, with the topic here. When you ask, what is happiness? Well, goodness gracious, that's a huge, I mean, that's not easily defined. And I think one of the things that's fun and useful about, at least temporarily, just sort of restricting ourselves to a logical philosophical exploration here is it gives us the opportunity to kind of slowly approach the subject matter, right? Instead of just kind of laying down a definition from the catechism or something, we could actually sort of slowly approach it and kind of appreciate it, I think, in its complexity a little bit more than if we just sort of lay down a definition. Obviously, happiness, Aristotle says at the beginning, happiness is what all men aim for. If you ask, do you want to be happy?
Sure.
I mean, what kind of psychotic person is going to say no? I mean, like if somebody said no, you'd be like, okay, you're kidding. Like you're just being a smart aleck or something.
Yeah. Nobody says that.
Yeah, nobody said. I mean, what's the alternative of happiness? What, you want to be depressed? You want to be angry? You want to be sad? I mean,
right?
I mean, everybody wants to be happy, right? So I think it's useful to, when you're approaching happiness. Okay, so then you say, okay, well, what is it? Well, I think for a lot of Americans, it would just be satisfaction, right? Or you feel satisfied, that kind of thing. Do you feel appreciated? Because I mean, I don't even know. Like when most Americans use it, I think they mean something like that, right?
Yeah, I think someone even lower it to "I'm content."
Yeah, right.
Sadly, you know. But
Um,
yeah,
so I got lots of stuff, maybe,
yeah,
that could be part of
accomplishments.
it. Yeah, right, this sort of thing. I think it's useful to when we're trying to define happiness, then to start with human action,
Mhm.
right? Sort of start with sort of the particular, then kind of move our way up towards the general.
Sure.
Um, so when you think about human action in general, this is what Aristotle does. He says, well, all human action aims for an end,
Hmm.
right? And then he also says all human action is for the good. And so you have to, if you take those two together, it starts to get at actually quite a lot when you start to think about it. Our actions are not um, goalless, right? That
Yeah.
is, when we act with some end in view, some objective in view, right? From the time I got up this morning, I was doing things here in the house. Um, and doing them with a view to getting ready for this podcast, right? So you could ask, why are you doing that? Well, I'm doing X because I need to get ready for the podcast,
Yeah.
right? The fact that we act for an end, it's that end that motivates the action, right?
Sure.
It
Sure.
moves you. That's why it can be called, under one aspect of the final cause, right? It's what it's what accounts for and makes the action to happen. I'm doing this for a reason, and that's why we can answer the question why, right?
Right.
When I ask my kids why they did something, and they say I don't know, no,
That's
let's talk this one through.
right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
We had a reason, didn't we? Right. Or if you really don't, then I say you don't act. Don't do it if you don't know why you're doing it.
Right. Yeah, and you would even, yeah, we even recognize when somebody's doing something that's pointless or aimless. Like if they're just like walking around to no end, you're like,
Mm,
are you lost?
that's
What are you looking for? Like, you ask your kids that if you just see them kind of wandering around the house.
right. Right.
Like
Mm,
we recognize, like, yeah, there has to be an end, right? If
that's
there's
right.
not an end, well, what do you do? Why are you doing it? Yeah.
Right. Right.
The
Yeah.
why is important.
Yeah, so I mean, I just Aristotle just takes it as a fact of human
Sure.
psychology, right?
Yeah.
It's a fact of the psychology of human action, that we do things for reasons, right? For objectives. Now, in saying that, right, these objectives could be large or small, right?
Right.
From earning a college degree and getting married to just getting ready for the day, right?
Yeah.
Creating an enjoyable afternoon for your kids, or you know what I mean, so it could be big projects, it could be little projects, right? Or
Sure.
something in sort of in between. Now that second statement's also important, which is that all human action is for the good, right? So you think, well,
Yeah.
that sounds awfully naive, right? Is Aristotle being a little too
Yep.
optimistic there, right? Because you could, doesn't seem that all human action is for the good. Of course, Aristotle's not being naive.
Yeah.
What he means is that we do something insofar as we see it to be desirable in one way or another, right?
Right. The
So
perceived good. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. So the what I like to call the fourth donut, right? You go for the fourth donut because you perceive it to be desirable. It's not really, right? And really, you're at the point of diminishing returns when it comes to donut consumption, which I know something about. But maybe the third donut, maybe you should stop
No,
at two.
no,
I don't
no,
know. What
no,
do you think, Jason? You know
no,
what it is.
no. And on special feasts, you can even go for the fourth,
Okay,
my
but you
opinion.
perceive it to be good, desirable. Like if you said, "Well, why do you want the donut?" Say, "Because it tastes good," and then you say, "Well, why do you want to do what tastes good? Because it's pleasurable." And you're like, "Why do you want to do what's pleasurable?" Like, what are you talking about? Like, what's the opposite, right? Like pain, like you know what I mean? Like I want to do, yeah.
Yeah.
Pleasure is not a fully sufficient explanation for human action,
Sure.
right? Because we're rational agents, but it does have a lot of explanatory power, right? Like,
Hmm.
like it's not, unless you've never experienced pleasure, which would be weird, then you should understand what I mean. Like I do it because it's pleasing, like it feels good. What else am I gonna say?
Yeah.
Like at that point, right? So, of course, there are other reasons that they see things to be desirable. Sometimes things are desirable, perceived to be desirable because we see them to be useful, and then sometimes we see them to be desirable because they're the right thing to do. Right?
Right.
They're virtuous. They are a duty, or however you want to put it. There, I don't want to be too narrow in one way or the other, but
Sure.
it just this is the kind of thing that has to be done. St. Thomas, inheriting Aristotle's way of talking, causes this the bonum honestum, right? Or which can be understood as the honest good, but also sometimes you could think of it as the praiseworthy good, right?
Yeah.
We don't praise a man for doing something that's pleasurable. I mean, that's cool, but we don't say, oh, that's honorable, right?
Yeah.
Right. But we do praise a man for defending the city or, raising his children well, right?
Right. And I think you do have to, and I think even St. Thomas says that, the pleasure must be connected to the good, right?
Sure.
So if something is pleasurable and it is not good, then it's not good, right?
That's right. Yeah. So what's going on there, right, is say with fornication, right?
Sure.
Fornication, or let's go with adultery. It's a little bit clearer. Like adultery, right? There's an injustice, right, to the spouse, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a morally bad act. It's a shameful act, right? Not praiseworthy. But but it's still done insofar as it seemed to be good. That it's done as pleasurable, right?
Yeah.
And the man, I mean, sometimes we act as if people aren't capable of malice. That's false. Malice is when you do something and you know it's wrong, but you do it under the aspect in which it is desirable, right? So insofar as pleasure is desirable, right? You could say, well, it's kind of good, like from a natural point of view, maybe like just in the sense of like the satisfaction, right? The sexual desire.
Yeah.
But it's morally wrong still, and it's morally wrong. You're just isolating on the aspect in which it's desirable, right?
Which humans are really good about that too.
That's right.
Really good about justifying sin.
That's right. So anyways, does that threefold distinction make sense?
Yeah absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, so and I think it's a pretty good, I mean, you might want to add some other nuances to it, but I think it's a pretty good taxonomy there in terms of what we perceive to be desirable. And then at that point, key, what's important about that is that accounts for the ends that we pursue. We pursue, so we act for an end, but we act for ends that we see to be desirable. Something comes up sort of as an end, as choice worthy, as an object to be pursued because it's perceived to be good. That is desirable in some way or the other. So I think once you've got that down as kind of your understanding of the psychology and really structure, baseline structure, there's a lot more to it, of course, but the baseline structure for particular human actions, I think we can use those same tools and same ideas to talk about happiness, or talk about sort of life in general, right? So Aristotle brings up this question. This is in book 1, chapters 1 and 2 of, well, there's some things are desired, like the useful good, right? Only for the sake of something else.
Yeah.
Right. So if it's merely useful, it's chosen because of something else, right? So this is kind of interesting. We start to get into it. I think especially Americans have a tendency towards esteeming use, right? The usefulness as that maybe the best thing, and of course, the useful good is good, right? Like it is valuable, but it's only valuable for something else. If that something else didn't exist, it wouldn't be valuable, right?
Right.
And I think this is really interesting, especially when it comes to the issue of work. Very often I think there's a tendency among some people to overestimate, right, the value of work. Work can be valuable in itself insofar as we think of it as an art, right? There's a kind of perfection that can be there, perfection of a certain skill. But the really interesting thing is that skill doesn't make you a good man, and it doesn't make your life a good life.
Yeah.
right? And that's different than a virtue. See, a virtue perfects the man, an art perfects the product. So you can be making really great products, but still be a bad man and have a miserable life. You know,
Plenty of examples there. Plenty of examples out there.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think connected to that is the recognition is, sometimes our jobs, most of our jobs involves the delivery of some good or service, right? And so
Sure.
that way we can esteem them, even if it's just working at a restaurant. I mean, you're helping people to feed, right? To eat,
Right.
So that's cool.
Have leisure time, like you could even. I mean,
Sure. Yeah. So there's there is some value in almost all of the work that people do, but from the employee's perspective, probably what's paramount is the utility involved, right, of the salary. Very few of us would do what we do for free.
Right.
And that kind of points you to, okay, maybe there are some things we do for free, but okay, yeah, the major value from the employee's perspective is this is useful.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
So it's not an end in and of itself. That it's a means to another end.
That's right. That's right.
You're working for something else. In this case, it's usually a paycheck, right?
That's right.
And then the probably a modern problem is when we see that as the end. But again, we're called to look at, okay, well, then we have money, which is again means to something else, not in and of itself.
Yeah. I mean, if you just sat there, was it Scrooge McDuck? I remember it was a cartoon as a kid, right? And he just liked to swim in his money.
Oh yeah.
But that's obviously stupid, right? I mean, I mean, there's no pleasure you can really derive from it. It's just weird.
Yeah, that is right.
And like if you just have the money stacked up all around you, you're like, I mean, you can pet it or something. I don't know. Like this, it's useless, right? You can't eat it.
Yeah.
It's not useless. It has no value in itself. Its only value is in what it can purchase, right?
Yeah, exactly. And and I would say even for for our listeners, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, if taken any Dr. Smith's courses, he ends it with, I hope you have found this to be useful and helpful, right? Right. The reason why we learn and talk about these things is not just so we have this knowledge to, throw around or something, or even something like that, but it's for the purpose of building virtue and good men and good people. And,
that's right.
It has a higher end. That's
right.
not just the attainment of it or something like that. Right.
Although the attainment's good.
And necessary, right? If you want to achieve that end, you do have to attain it to some degree, right? But yes. So
Aristotle asked this question about, is there something that we never desire for the sake of something else? So he's asking, he recognizes that there are these sort of chains of motivation, you could say, kind of series of motivations. I do this for X, and I do X for Y, and I do what, right? But it's got to come to an end at some point, right? I mean, sometimes, when people have like a midlife crisis or something like that, or experience extreme dissatisfaction in their job, they ask, well, what is it all for, right? Like, it doesn't seem to really matter. Like, if you just have this kind of endless chain, right, of actions and motivations, doesn't it need to terminate somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Now, sometimes people accuse Aristotle here of making a bad analogy or inference, basically something like, well, since every chain has an end, there must be an end to the chain of my motivations, right? And that's not true. What he's saying is something I think deeper, which is that human psychology is set up such that it needs a sufficient cause, and such things are a sufficient motivation. And things that are dependently motivating. Now, this should sound a little bit like the first cause kind of argumentation.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, things that are dependently motivating depend on something that motivates independently, right?
Yeah,
per se, right? That's a per se kind of hierarchy there. So, like, that's, I think, important to realize, right? That it has to be the case that there are things that I'm aiming for their own sake, or if I don't have something like that, that there's something incoherent about myself, incoherent about my psychology.
Sure.
And that's why I end up being kind of I don't know, confused and disoriented at times, right?
Hmm.
Because I'm not adhering to a proper psychological order, right? In which I, pursue um, dependently motivating things for independently motivating things, right? And so he asked, is it possible that we have something like this for our whole life? And of course, he says, well, maybe happiness, right? Which you're like, okay, good, yeah, that's probably right. I mean, if
Yeah.
you think about something like the Declaration of Independence, right? The pursuit of happiness is right there. Um, that that if you were to ask just at a basic kind of conversational level, why do you want to get married? Why do you want
Yeah.
to have a job that provides you with enough money and is at least decently fulfilling or decently pleasant? Why do you want children? Why do you go on vacations twice a year? Maybe like you start, see what I'm saying?
Oh
Like
yeah.
why do you like to hunt or backpack or something like that? Because like for example, for most people, hunting is a sport, right? I mean, it's not like actually you do it because that's how you survive, right?
Right.
It's a leisure activity, basically, right? Um, it may be strenuous, but it's still a leisure activity, right? Something you do for its own sake. Same with
Sure.
backpacking. I love backpacking. I like to backpack a lot myself, but it is kind of like the most useless activity in the world.
Yeah. I
Because
just
you're just walking down a trail with all this stuff on your back,
yeah,
right?
I just did a trip with some of my kids. My wife was like, "Is this really how you want to spend your days off?" Like
That's
she didn't understand it. Like she's like, "You want to
right.
put like 40 pounds on your back,
That's right.
hike 4 miles, and sleep on the ground?
That's
Like,
right. That's right. Yeah.
how about we go to
Yeah.
the beach?" You know, like
That's right. That's right. That's right. It's a party. Go on.
oh, so I love it though. It's great. Yeah.
It is. It is. But anyways, yeah. So uh, uh, I think that if the conversation went long enough, I think you would start to say, okay, well, I do all these things in the pursuit of happiness,
Yeah.
right? Like the various things in my life, I do them because um, I want to be happy, right? That still doesn't quite get us to a definition of happiness, right?
Sure.
But that is sort of, I think, Aristotle's getting at the idea of, well, like if you ask why do you want to be happy, the conversation's over, right?
Yeah.
Like in Aristotle's view, like it just that whatever happiness is, everything is for happiness, and happiness isn't for the sake of something else.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I think that's something that's just key to not just remember, but when you're talking with somebody that the end of happiness involves the entire activity of man. Like it
That's
involves
right.
everything about you. It's not just simply like happiness is success. Happiness is um just this, or happiness is
Mm,
just that, or it's recognition, fame, money. You
mhm.
can't boil it down to one of these things. um it doesn't necessarily include everything, but it does involve everything of who man is.
Yeah, it involves
Yeah.
everything. That's right. So I think sometimes people think about happiness as what happens outside of work or something like that, right? Like, sometimes people say, "Well, I need a work-life balance." I'm like, "Well, like, are you not alive when you're at work? I mean, like, what does that mean?" No, like, work is part of your life, right?
Yeah.
And some people kind of get that mixed up and kind of make work their life, right?
Right.
Rather than make it a part. But yeah, it's one organic whole, and it all sort of ultimately points towards happiness, right?
Sure.
Um, as what you're pursuing in the various aspects. Now, again, I think that's just at sort of a conversational level, common sense level.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think that Aristotle's very one of the things I like about Aristotle is his respect for common sense, right? And his respect for the common way of talking. Like sometimes he says, "Let's just see what people say." That's not a sufficient answer, but it's a good place to begin. And what he has to say here, then I think, if we're starting to think about, okay, um, what is what is the definition of happiness? Okay, so we're all aiming for that, Maybe
Right.
once we understand the definition, we can give even more reasons why we're aiming for it, right? But we're all aiming for happiness. So what is it?
Hmm.
Okay. And a helpful distinction here, which we've already distinguished between for its own sake and for the sake of something else,
Yeah.
right? Another helpful distinction here is between the perfect and the imperfect,
Hmm.
right? That is between the complete end and the incomplete end,
Hmm.
right? Now, where do we see this? Well, if we think about it, there are probably several different things in my life that I do for their own sake, right?
Hmm.
For example, at a kind of trivial level, right? Maybe backpacking, going fishing, um, um, watching football, right? Football fan, learning, thinking about football, um, studying history at this point it does actually is useful to me, but for the most part, I do it for its own sake, right? Just to
Right.
learn, right? Just because I enjoy it. Um, so things like that, more significant, say relating to my children, right? So being a good father,
Hmm.
developing my relationship with my children. I don't do that for the sake of something else, right? Like I don't use
Right.
my children, right, um, in order to accomplish some other project, right?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. You don't sit there and think, okay, I need to be good to my kids so that they'll grow up and enter the workforce, and then that will put money in Social Security, and I'll be able to retire. Like, not that I've thought about this, but I'm just saying. But that's
That's what
not why. Yeah, it's not
that's
why
what I
I act.
used to like to say to my students. You guys need to go out and earn a lot of money because Social Security is going bankrupt.
That's right.
You
Yeah,
got to pay a
but
lot of taxes.
yeah, it makes for a good joke, but yeah,
Yeah,
it doesn't
it's not
motivate me in
reality.
the morning. It's not why I do what I do.
Right. And then
Right.
also say with your relationship with your spouse, of course,
Sure.
is for its own sake ultimately. Um, Certainly, as a husband, I'm sure you aspire to be both pleasant and useful.
Aspire.
Right.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, right, the spouse is loved for his or her own sake, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then, at the deepest level, of course, our relationship with God, right? So even if we don't want to bring into view the like eternal beatitude, we can just still think about prayer and
Sure.
contemplation, right? As those are things I do really for their own sake, right? Like I don't. It is true that having a consistent prayer habit or a consistent habit of contemplation makes my life better in a lot of
Mhm.
different ways, but ultimately, you know, my life isn't a higher end, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Than God, right? And so, really that's something I do for its own sake. In a lot of ways, life is ordered towards that end, right? If
Sure.
that makes sense. So there's lots of ends in our lives, lots of objectives that are desired for their own sake.
Hmm.
But leaving off prayer and contemplation, if you go back to the other examples I had about relationships or leisure
Hmm.
or just kind of trivial things, um, you wouldn't say that your whole life, right? Or that you desire everything for the sake of watching football, right?
Right.
If you did, I would say you were disordered.
Exactly.
Right? There's something wrong with you. You're a very truncated person, right? Right. You're not really that because why is that? Because your humanity is broader than football, right? As great as the sport is, it's your humanity encompasses more than the game of football, right? Um, and your life does, right? There's like your life has lots of different parts to it. Do you really live in order for the sake of football? Right. That would be, that would be strange. Right.
Yeah.
And wouldn't really make sense. Um, how would that help you with your human relationships? I mean, you would only have human relationships with other people who, I guess, joined you in watching football or something. Right. The other thing that you would want to kind of bring into view, right, is even say with relationships, right, as important as they are, um, and they are very important. They're not complete ends, right? They're imperfect
Yeah.
as ends, because they don't cover everything, right? I mean, if somebody tells you, you're my whole life, right? In a romantic, I hope
Mm,
not.
yeah.
I'm gonna let you down.
Yep.
Right? You're gonna be disappointed.
You're
Right?
putting a lot of pressure on me right there. That's
That's
right.
right. Yeah. So I think our relationships are important. They are for their own sake, but they're incomplete as an end for a human being.
Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, and I would even say, I mean, not, we use the football example because that's an easy one to understand.
Mhm.
But you can even put even something higher than, watching football there.
Mhm.
You can even put, a noble profession, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's still not going to be this kind. It's still going to be an imperfect end.
Mhm.
It's still going to be lacking something.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I think you're right. It's not going to account. It's not going to give you a way of um, thinking about and evaluating your whole life, right?
Right.
So, whatever happiness is, happiness needs to not be one of those, right? That is,
Yeah.
so what we're talking about here at this level, we're not talking about the merely useful. We're talking about something that's good for its own sake, but is imperfect.
Right.
And so, this is something that is capable as imperfect of being desired for its own sake and desired for the sake of something else.
Yeah.
Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I remember, I think it was Peter Kraft put it, he
Mhm.
put it this way. He said, nothing less than yourself can fulfill yourself. Right. So there's kind of a hierarchy here
Mhm.
with regard talking about happiness and fulfillment. Right. So, and he says, nothing in this world is more than yourself. Right. So, kind of pointing to there's nothing really in this world that's going to fulfill ourselves. Like there's nothing going to be now. Granted, maybe we're getting into theology here, getting past just the philosophical perspective. Um, but having that kind of understanding of even some of even the best things of this world are still
Mhm.
less than yourself, less than who you are.
Mhm.
So to look at something lesser and to say it will fulfill you
Mhm.
is going to leave you maybe
Mhm.
uh, uh, in a problematic state, right?
There, you're of course,
Obviously,
Jason, talking like sort of like the ontological dignity, right,
sure,
of being of the human person, of human nature, right?
yeah,
Not your ego.
right, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm not saying,
Right, right. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. But that's true. Like in terms of your human nature, right? Like, um, fornication falls is contrary to human nature. But even a good, healthy marriage, right?
yeah,
Isn't the total actualization of human nature. Is that what you're getting at
right,
there? Yeah.
yeah. That that there's that the human person and who they are is not just complex, but
Mm.
just
Deep and broad.
like we said, it involves everything. It involves the totality of the human person.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and there's nothing in this world that's going to
Right.
satisfy every aspect
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
happiness involves because it's
Hmm.
deep within the soul. It's not material.
That's right. Right. Right.
So yeah, so I mean I don't know if that's a good
No, I
distinction
think
to,
that's helpful there, right, in terms of distinguishing the imperfect and the perfect.
yeah,
The perfect would be something, right, that is complete for the human person, right?
right, right,
Um, Now, staying sort of at the philosophical level right now, we can at least just say that with these second level goods that are desirable for their own sake and desirable for the sake of something else,
sure,
that they are praiseworthy goods, right? So they're real goods are not merely useful, but they remain imperfect, right? They're
right,
incomplete. And one way of thinking about their incompleteness, right? Their imperfection. Some people get insulted, like my marriage is an incomplete good. Well, try to pay attention, okay?
yeah,
Right. We mean for your whole life, right? Your whole life. I mean, obviously, your marriage involves everything. It
yeah,
impacts everything, but it's not the it's not the sole good, right?
Right.
That everything else is necessarily desired for, right? It is a high end and, higher than most, right? But
Right.
it's not such an end that it can't be desired for something else. And the question, the way to see that is to say, well, why? Is there a reason you got married? Right? And you would say, I think because you wanted to be happy.
Yeah.
And that shows you that happiness is above, right?
Right.
Marriage, right? And whatever happiness is, it's the perfect good, right?
Yeah. I
It's the
perceived it. I
complete
perceived
good.
a good. The
Mhm.
desire, the desire grew,
Mhm.
and marriage fulfills that desire.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
so
Yeah, in part, right?
in part, yeah, 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 yeah.
So now we're back at happiness being the perfect good, right? So we know it is a perfect good. Um,
So is there a perfect
happiness
end?
has to be a perfect good, right? Sorry.
Yeah. So is there a perfect end?
Yeah, right, right. And so this is interesting. Now, I think as Christians, of course, we could jump to, right,
Sure.
the beatific vision and so forth. But I kind of want to hold off on doing that because I think it's just interesting and maybe instructive, right? To look at this, maybe just force ourselves to stay at a philosophical level, a level of natural reason for just a few more minutes. I like this idea of thinking about it that way because then you say, okay, well, what is the complete good, right? What would be the complete good? So if happiness has to be the complete good, the perfect good, what would that be if we're staying at the natural level? And one thing, this is an odd saying in Aristotle that I find really interesting to think about, but he makes this claim that we should call no man happy until he is dead. It's really kind of odd, right, at first.
Yeah.
Um, and what his example is Priam from the Iliad, right, who had lived a virtuous, prosperous, uh, pleasant life,
Mhm.
right? Very pleasant, right? um, but ends with his whole kingdom being destroyed, his family wiped out, Hector slain and humiliated, dragged around the city, I think it has heels or something. I don't know, whatever. But it was just awful, right?
Yeah.
His body mutilated. Um, and so Priam, from Aristotle's point of view, right? Great tragedy like that, right? Mars one's life,
Mm. Mhm.
right? Um, this isn't just losing a spouse. This isn't just losing a beloved child, as bad as those things are,
Yeah.
which those things themselves can just by themselves, right, can put people off, right, in terms
Sure.
of their lives, right, maybe for the rest of their lives, right, to kind of back up Aristotle's point. That he thinks that if you're desperately poor, right, he doesn't think you need to be wealthy in order to be happy, but he does think you need to not be desperately poor, right?
Yeah.
If you're desperately poor, right, like you can't really even have friendships, you can't have any real leisure, you're just barely scraping by, right? Your life is full of fear, um, that sort of thing. Such a person, their life becomes marred. The desperately poor, right, end up being concerned only with what?
Money. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Oddly enough, right, kind of like at the opposite end of the miser, in a way, but because they're so bereft of that, right,
Sure.
that sort of thing. So I think that's interesting. It makes me think what Aristotle has in mind here, and I'm going to kind of extrapolate a little bit, but is the idea that happiness, one is happy when one is living a desirable life, right? A
Yeah.
good life for a human being across time and across spectrums, right? So across time, that's why it says for your whole life, right?
Right. Right.
Until you're dead, right?
So you're dead.
Um, and across spectrums, right? So you think about maybe like your physical life, your sexual life, your social life, your political life, professional life, family. Like, see how you can divide it up into different like categories, right? So so that uh, the perfect good, the complete good for a human being, right, is to live well and in a desirable way across spectrums of action, categories of action, and across
Hmm.
time, right? And you think about, this is something we don't think about as much in America, maybe because we're obsessed with the youth. I don't know, but like the Greeks had this idea of stages in a man's life, right?
Hmm.
And there's the youth. The youth becomes the farmer or the warrior, right? And then he becomes the statesman,
Yeah.
and then he becomes the priest, right? In Plato's Laws, he talks about this idea, right? That all of them become priests and philosophers at the end of life, really, which I think is kind of interesting, right? They kind of
Yeah.
advise the statesman, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But so that a good life is one that is desirable across the. So a good man is a man who at one time was a good youth, a good athlete, a good, from a Greek point of view, lover. Um, then a great warrior or farmer, then an effective statesman or citizen, and ends his life as a wise priest or philosopher, right? That is a life, so you say, like a
Yeah.
whole, right? That is desirable for, say, a man in ancient Athens. What do you think about that, Jason?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth to that, because I mean, we, because we, again, we learn through our senses and we desire things,
Mm-hmm.
through our senses. We we see somebody who has virtue, and we say
Mm-hmm.
we want that, but we also see people that are like not poor, and you're like, I want that too. Like, so I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's just there's I think there's a lot of truth to that we don't just seek, virtue. Again, we're fallen human beings, but it's not always
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not saying it's because of our sinfulness, but I mean, like, we desire, to have these external goods, which,
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle's bringing up here,
Mm-hmm.
to have those, to at least sufficiently have those, to not, like you said, not be desperately poor, not be these things. And that's not wrong to seek those
No,
things, right?
no, it's
that's
not.
that's perfectly normal and healthy. But it's important to not reduce your happiness to those things,
That's
right?
true.
Or for us to tell poor people, well, just be virtuous, you'll be
Right.
happy. Like, no, you can't.
Right.
that
Yeah,
that
but
you know
we
I
get
think,
the poor guy's like, I'm starving though.
right. Well, have you tried being good? Like, that will fill your soul. No, my belly. Like,
That's right.
there's a there
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a great point in Aristotle, that he recognizes that,
Mm-hmm.
happiness, it involves it involves these all of these things, right? It
That's right.
involves, it can't just be reduced to, no, yeah, I'm not again, not getting into Christianity and things like that, but I think
Mhm.
there's something to that.
Yeah,
There's a
yeah.
lot to that, I think, actually.
So one thing that, if you think about it this way, is like, think about it from a pedagogical perspective, right? Um, you're trying to teach your kids, right, virtue. So you can say things like, well, if you want to be effective, right, across these different stages of life, if you want to be effective across different categories of life,
Hmm.
well, what do you need? You need the virtues,
Yeah.
right? To be a good, rational businessman, citizen, lover, friend, right? All those things, right? You need to. That actually takes reason, right? You
Yeah.
need to be rational in order to do those things well. If for nothing else, be able to figure out how to balance them all and coordinate them all. I mean, one of the things that we struggle with, right, especially in our modern lives, right, is the way to blend all these things together, right, in an effective mixture or hierarchy, right?
Sure.
How do I bring all these things together? Well, you know what? If you're an idiot, you're not going to do a good job,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
You need your reason, right, in order to do to think about those things, and you need to be not impulsive, right? That is,
Yeah.
not just follow your passions without reason. Passions are good, They just need to be sort of aimed and guided by reason. And so that brings into view the other virtues like fortitude and temperance, right? Which control and direct the irascible passions as well as the concupiscible passions. And then finally, all of this involves interrelations with others. So you're going to have to be just, right?
Yeah.
So like all of the virtues, if you think about the way the virtues act, right, as perfective habits, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can think about them as rules, but think about them as perfective habits. They're the things that empower us to do well, right?
Right.
Across categories and across stages of life, right?
Yeah.
When the young man above all needs temperance, right? And obedience. Over time, he needs to become just, right? That sort of thing, and hopefully it grows in wisdom, right? Especially when he enters the political time. When I say political, I mean when you're a full citizen, right? Contributing to the community. So that makes a lot of sense to me of the virtues in a natural perspective, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think maybe a good way to look at it and talk about it is, the virtues, they order the soul.
Mm-hmm,
And I remember in one of your recent classes, you said, well, what does it mean to be ordered?
Right.
It means to be organized toward an end.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And this is again goes back to what we're talking about here, that
Sure.
the virtues order the soul. The virtues organize the soul towards happiness, towards an end.
Yeah, and that end is this complete desirable life for a man.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's really the key. So, you imagine the Aristotelian man, right? He's trying to go through his life. He's really creating a life, right? He's crafting a desirable life.
Yeah.
That at the end of it, he can say, I was blessed, right? I did well, right? That sort of thing over the course of the whole thing, right?
Right.
That's, I think, kind of the aspiration, right, of the Aristotelian man, right, is to die looking at his life in retrospect, right, and being able to say yes.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's an interesting way of, and to even put it, this will sound a little weird, a little bit of a Nietzschean spin on it, but is to say, yes, I would do that again and again and again. Right.
Yeah.
That's a way of I think thinking about the life you're living and what you're striving for, right?
Yeah, or even to put in the words of St. Robert Bellarmine, right, in his classic work, The Art of Dying Well, which is always a good Lenten read, right? The art, not to ruin it for anybody, but the art of dying well is living well. Mm-hmm. Because there is this, again, to see the goods and to pursue the goods, right? Mm-hmm. But to also, and this is part of the struggle, is to be always, again, like you were talking about, having our reason govern our passions, right? To be clarifying our motives, to be, and again, this is where the cultivation of virtue comes in, where we don't just want to, I don't want to live my life saying I'm just going to do what I perceive to be good. No, I want to do what is actually good.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. But in order to recognize what is actually good, I have to have the tools, the skills, the virtue, right? That internal organization towards the end of happiness. I got to have that within me, right? My soul has to be great.
Yeah, right.
And again, going back to Aristotle, to some degree, I do have to have, things like, I can't be just, overwhelmed with thinking about money because I'm poor or something like that. Or if I'm constantly wondering where my next meal is coming from,
sure.
Then it leaves very little time for me to work on these things and stuff like that. So
you think about too, like a lot of the categories I named, right, are things like being a citizen, being a husband, being a friend, right? All of those are very social. They're very context laden. They're very circumstantial, right? for Aristotle, one of the blessings of prosperity is that it makes it possible for you to be a magnanimous citizen, right?
Yeah.
The magnanimous man is kind of the highest man in civic life, right? For Aristotle, he's the man who goes above the taxes. Think about that. Somebody who just out of largesse, out of love of his country, right? Does something great, right? That was actually expected in ancient society, right? That the wealthy out of largesse would, aggrandize and build up and edify the political community. That's one of the things the desperately poor man can't do. He can't feast his friends, right? You think it's funny sometimes in the Bible, right? When this comes up, like the importance of being able to feast your friends, right? That sort of thing. This is going to be kind of scandalous to some people, but Aristotle very clearly also says that if you're hideously ugly, you can't be happy. Right. And that's a terrible thing to say. And maybe that'll help us kind of see maybe some limitations of this approach.
Yeah.
What he means, right, is like, if you're hideously ugly, it might not be that easy for you to socialize with other people. Right. And that might be something bad about us. Right. It certainly doesn't sound very Christian, but you can kind of get like from a common sense, practical point of view, it's better to be beautiful. Right. Yeah. Handsome men and beautiful women do better than their opposites, right? They're like, put it this way, their paths are a little bit smoother sometimes, right?
Yeah, there's a great Seinfeld episode about that. So,
oh yeah,
I think it's with John. Yeah, it's with John Hamm. Yeah, it's great. Okay. Go check it out. The guy's just horrible at everything, but everybody praises him as he's the best because he's very handsome.
He's very handsome,
but he's just horrible at everything he does. But people are like, "Oh, thanks, that's great." But it was just because he was like, great episode.
That's funny. But just say it's something less, sure. Something or a different. Like just say the tragically antisocial person, right? The person who just can't deal with small talk, making good conversation, how to relate to people, that kind of thing.
Sure.
Their lives are going to be harder, right? In a way. And especially in these categories we've been talking about, like being the warrior, being the farmer, being the statesman, right? Or the good citizen, or the effective businessman or business leader. All of those are things that he's going to struggle with. Now, I think that criteria, right, then does call into view, right, the way in which happiness does, to some degree, depend on external circumstances in Aristotle's view.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not just my virtue, right?
Yeah.
It involves to some degree external circumstances. But I just think that's kind of realistic and goes and fits with the idea that happiness is living a desirable life as a whole.
As a whole, yeah.
I've emphasized, sort of the end of life perspective on that, right? That is, you look back at your life and say yes, but that also goes with your current. It can serve as a criteria for your current, right?
Yeah.
Situation. You can, if I ask you in the context of this conversation, if I ask you, Jason, are you happy? What I'd be asking you is, are you flourishing? Right? Are you effective in your current state of life across your categories of action? Does that make sense?
Yeah, you'd be asking me, would I do it again?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And you might say mostly, but maybe I would kind of wish that this I had not done this part or that part, right?
Yeah.
JC, that's a criterion, right? And you're like, okay, well,
most of us just call it the college years, right?
That would be a criterion where you say, okay, well, I need to improve in this area, or I need to change this or change that, or maybe this part's really good. I just need to make sure I keep on keeping on. But that gives you a criteria both for today and for the whole sort of your life, right? If you're thinking about it as, what I'm trying to do is create a complete life as a whole. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. There's a totality to it. It's not a feeling, right?
That's right. It's not a feeling.
It's not reduced to simple pleasure. It's not reduced to contentment. It's not reduced to a lot of those things.
Yeah.
There's a totality to it that involves everything in man.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I think it's useful just as practical. Like when I think about my own life and how I'm living, or how like it is a, a, a practical criteria, a practical model for evaluating myself and evaluating where I'm going and what I've done and that sort of thing, right? And I think that's good for us, even at a natural point perspective, right?
Sure, absolutely. And I think even, and to maybe make a point for our listeners, like it's good to like you said in the beginning, like explore and wonder about
Mm,
these things, because I think as Catholics, sometimes we immediately jump to like the
mhm,
apologetic side of it, or even the theological side of it.
mhm,
We want to quickly jump to God and get there as quickly as possible,
mhm.
which is good motivation for like our spiritual
Sure.
lives and stuff. But at the same time, there's good exercise in exploring God's creation, right?
Mhm, mhm,
So
mhm,
this, the design of the human person,
mhm.
right?
Yes, that's
you
right.
know
Yeah.
that's what we're exploring. So I mean, while we say we're trying to limit it to the realm of philosophy and things like that, it doesn't mean that we're doing this kind of from an atheistic point of view,
Yeah.
but we're doing it from a point of view of we're gonna look at God's creation. We're gonna look at
Right.
and it really, this serves very well, or I think it's easy to see when you look at kind of Aristotle's vision here. You can really see a good foundation for a correct Christian anthropology,
That's right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think actually this model sets you up nicely to pivot
sure.
to a higher perspective. So one of the things that's nice about having going through this exercise, right, and thinking about happiness in natural terms, is it actually then serves as a really great sort of prologue or introduction to,
Yeah.
right, the Christian life. So maybe in our next episode, Jason, what we could do is explore kind of the deficiencies with this model, right, that we've
Sure.
developed. So, I mean, I think this is a good model in a lot of ways, but I think there's also some really interesting things about it that you might want to criticize that actually kind of push you in the direction of Christian living, right?
Yeah.
That maybe includes the best aspects of what we've talked about, but
Right.
also answers some problems that are inherent in that. The problems inherent in that Aristotelian model are sometimes talked about under the title of the fragility of happiness, right? And I
Yeah.
think there's something kind of right about that sort of phrase and the criticism that it includes. But we can talk about that next time.
Yeah. No, and I agree, but and I think on the flip side of that also, by looking at um happiness in Christianity built upon this Aristotelian,
Hmm.
foundation,
Hmm.
you could see some of the flaws of, or many of the flaws whether it's modern culture or even
Sure.
some aspects even within popular Catholicism, right?
Pseudo
Where,
Christianity.
yeah, where we could say, well, the moral character of a person is pretty dang important to
Hmm.
Aristotle.
Hmm.
But to some Christians today, it's not that important, right?
Hmm.
It's
Right.
there's other things, right? And it's, yeah. So I mean, I think it'll also be helpful in pointing out some of the flaws, or even in our own, and even in our own thinking, right? Because
Hmm.
again, we the happiness again being aimed at an end, right? We
Hmm.
have to be constantly being judgmental of okay, what is, in looking at ourselves, what is
Right.
the end toward which I'm acting? Is it selfish?
Hmm.
Is it actually a good? Is there a higher good?
Right.
Am I choosing a lesser good of a higher? So I mean, like all these things I think are very important with regards to really building upon that. So um all right, very good. Dr. Smith, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think you summed it up well. I think that this model it is. I'm not saying that everything we've said here is contained in Aristotle, but I think sort of inspired by Aristotle,
Sure.
which is that happiness is living a desirable life as a whole for a
Yeah.
man, right?
Yeah.
And by that I mean a human being, so that it's not the desirable life for a badger, or it's not the desirable life for an angel. It's the desirable life for a human being. And so that criterion set by human nature, but then we need to think about it over the lifespan of a man
Yeah.
and across the categories of action, and that actually presents us with at least something that's plausible as a complete good, right?
Yeah.
A
It's not
complete good is to have lived your whole life
yeah.
well.
Happiness is not a temporary state.
No, yeah,
Right.
right, yeah,
You know?
yeah.
So I think that's
It's an achievement, really.
Yeah. And again, you can't judge an achievement before your life is over.
That's right. That's right.
So, sorry, folks. But all right, cool. All right, we'll tackle that next time. So hope this was good for all of our listeners. Hope you found it edifying. And check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Until next time, God bless.